10 years of marriage, if that man knows her well enough, he should know that physical punishment has no deterrent effect on her and will only leave her heart. Zhao Yan did not expect to be attracted to a lowly servant, and what surprised him even more was that the other party unknowingly refused him. The next day, the girl, who had always been bold and reckless, tricked him and ran away. He vowed to find this dog servant and tear her apart. On the night of his wedding, Zhao Yan angrily left after seeing the extremely ugly bride. From then on, he never gave her a good face. Little did he know that this woman was the one he couldn't forget in his heart. Su Weiqiu, a traveler from another world, deliberately disguised herself to vilify herself in order to protect herself in this patriarchal society. My younger sister laughed at her for not having anyone to ask for, but in the blink of an eye, she married into the royal family. What? Surprisingly, he is the blind and mute marriage partner of his own. A few years ago, she witnessed the ruthlessness and cruelty of this man. While other concubines were competing for favor, she regarded her husband as a fierce beast. Who understands the joy of farming, testing drugs, and pursuing a career as a married woman? Ling Wang's monologue. His wife is in harmony with all the people in the mansion, but she respects her husband and keeps her distance. Who can understand this pain? Subordinates have talent. The holy hand doctor is our mother. The shopkeeper Shen, who is accustomed to being tied around his waist, is also our mistress. Princess Ling's vest was taken off layer after layer, causing her a headache. What exactly did she marry? Keywords of the novel. Idol Mother without pop-ups. Download the complete collection of Idol Mother TXT, and read the latest chapters of Idol Mother. Chapter 1 Wedge. Female Prisoner, Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The source has no content or has errors. Chapter 2 Wedge. Female Prisoner, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Wedge. Female Prisoner, Part 2. There is only one oil lamp far apart in the prison, and most of the places are pitch black. The prisoners who were locked up in the prison camp were accustomed to the darkness, and the sudden light and the elegant young man excited them. Therefore, the three of them must have caused a commotion wherever they went. The boy ignored the wailing and howling voices on both sides and walked forward quickly under the guidance of Hongban. The deeper you go, the more gloomy the environment becomes, and the air emits an indelible smell of filth. Hongban couldn't even take a breath when he saw the young man's face looking a bit ugly. Prince, please come this way. Zhang Fugue saw the leader of the Hongban team leading towards the direction of the women's prison, and a vague sense of foreboding arose in his heart, causing his footsteps to pause. Hongban saw him standing still, so he couldn't help but reach out and push him, urging him. Under duress, Zhang Fugue had to grit his teeth and take another step forward. The woman lying on the straw heard the commotion and turned her head to look over. When she saw someone coming, she was slightly stunned and then slowly sat up. The young man stood outside, looking at the woman in the prison with a cold and heavy expression. Hongban reacted and quickly instructed Zhang Fugue, "Old Zhang, go, quickly open the prison door." The prison door was quickly opened, and the boy took a few steps forward. He was about to step in, hesitated for a moment, and then withdrew. At this moment, he saw the soup bowl lying on the ground. This meal is too shabby to feed livestock. The young man twisted his eyebrows and glanced at the two people behind him, wanting to speak out and question, but in the end, he restrained himself. Hongban also noticed the bowl of porridge and couldn't help but look at Zhang Fugue with a puzzled expression. Seeing his trembling face, he quickly became complacent and couldn't get angry at all. However, in front of the young man, he couldn't easily get angry. His old face suddenly turned into a pig liver color. "You two, step back." At the young man's command, the two of them dared not disobey or go far, so they quietly retreated several zhang. The young man stood outside the prison door, facing the people in the prison with 4 eyes. He didn't speak, and the woman in the prison didn't say a word. The two of them looked at each other silently, as if they were looking at who could be more calm. However, the young man was still young and couldn't hold back for a while. He put down his harsh words to the woman in the prison and said, "Zhao Su, if you dare to harm my sister again, I will kill you." Upon hearing these words, Su Weiqiu couldn't help but curl his lip slightly. You should know that this little ghost had already read the 4 books and 5 classics at the age of 6 or 7, and was deeply influenced by feudal ethics. He had always guarded the virtues of those laborious gentlemen and filial piety, and now he called himself Zhao Shusher. It seemed that he was really being pressured by him. She said lightly, "Speak well, who is Zhao Su?" Seeing her disdainful expression, Zhao Yi couldn't help but feel annoyed and added very irrationally, "If you dare to mess with my sister again, I will tell father where you stored the small vault." Upon hearing this, Su Weiqiu couldn't help but be secretly surprised. How did this little ghost know that he was hiding so deep? She had to say that she was a bit flustered in her heart and said, "What? You brat, don't forget that you were still born in October. How dare you threaten my mother? No big or small, is that how your master taught you?" She knew that her son had always been mature and dignified, and being a good young man made her look old. Su Weiqiu felt very regretful in his heart. It was really a waste of time that she gave him such a charming face. That is to say, when he is angry, his face will show a bit of cuteness that his age group should have. Therefore, she always couldn't help but anger him with nothing to do. So she asked, "You just said you don't want me to mess with anyone." Zhao Yi rolled his eyes and replied, "My sister." Upon hearing this, Su Weiqiu smiled and said, "What sister? Who told you that I must have a girl in my belly?" "I told you, Zhao Yi, if you want to anger me again, I will give you a younger brother to come out and let him compete with you for the throne." I thought the young man would be so angry that he would blow his beard and stare as usual, but to my surprise, he just pursed his lips. Then, he said calmly, "Okay, no problem. You'd better work hard with your father to give birth to more." Su Weiqiu's old face couldn't help blushing. "I'm leaving, you take it seriously." "Hey, aren't you here to save me from going out?" Zhao Yi looked at her. Her attire was not as noble as a queen's, and he couldn't help but shake his head in anger. "I used to be, but I've changed my mind now." "It's good for you to suffer a bit," he said, "stinky kid, no conscience." Zhang Fugue, who was only a few feet away, finally came to his senses from their conversation. He dared to worry about the head of the household in Huai, who was so scared that his legs became weak. With the woman's cursing, the young man walked over with broad strides. Zhang Fugue knelt down on the ground and struggled for a while before stumbling up and leaving hastily behind the young man quickly. The straw in the women's prison was removed and replaced with clean bamboo mats and a thin quilt. All 3 oil lamps were lit, shining brightly. Looking at the delicious food at the table in front of him, Su Weiqiu felt hungry. The prison guard, who had never given her a good face before, now stood trembling in front of her, with a look of bowing her knees that was annoying. Su Weiqiu didn't argue with him, just pushed the person aside and picked up the dishes to have a full meal. Half an hour later, Zhang Fugue walked in with a sincere and fearful expression, taking the remaining food and thoughtfully leaving behind an oil lamp. Under the overwhelming aura of food, Su Weiqiu felt drowsy and weak. As he lay down drowsy, he heard a steady and powerful sound of footsteps. Su Weiqiu opened her eyes, and her already extremely beautiful eyebrows and eyes flashed with a glimmer of hope, shining brightly. When she saw the man standing outside the prison, the light in her eyes suddenly dimmed. People, sometimes they really can't eat too much. Once they eat too much, they will have some unrealistic expectations, which she self-mocked in her heart. Gao Jiging looked at her and softly called out, "Sister-in-law." Su Weiqiu thought to himself, "Can't your uncles and nephews make an appointment to come together?" She insisted on disturbing people's dreams one by one, and she didn't hesitate to declare this dissatisfaction in her mouth. Upon hearing this, Gao Jiging couldn't help but sigh and say, "You can sleep here, and your heart is quite big." Su Weiqiu chuckled twice and said, "I'm flattered." Seeing her current situation, Gao Jiging couldn't bear it and couldn't help but speak out and advise her. "Sister-in-law, why are you suffering? Listen to my advice and stop being stubborn. Go and give the prince some comfort, and he will let you out." Faced with Gao Jiging's advice, Su Weiqiu fell silent for a moment before asking in a gloomy tone, "Are you sure?" Recalling the fierce force that Ling Wang had held onto her neck that day in his mind, Gao Jiging also fell silent for a moment. "You go back and let him know that neither of you is idle, and he will definitely blame me." Suddenly feeling dizzy, Su Weiqiu supported his forehead with one hand and continued. "I can eat and sleep here, there's nothing bad about it. If that man knows her well enough, he should know that locking her in such a place is not intimidating for her." After speaking these words, she felt her whole body feel weak, and the scene in front of her shook for a moment. Her breathing gradually became difficult, and even her fingertips felt a slight tingling. Su Weiqiu was studying medicine and soon realized something was wrong. Gao Jiging saw a sudden change in her expression and couldn't help but take 2 steps forward with a concerned expression, asking, "Sister-in-law, what's wrong with you?" Su Weiqiu's consciousness gradually blurred and he said, "Ji Jing, I feel like I've been drugged." As soon as she finished speaking, she fell to the ground and began to twitch all over her body, with a painful shape. "Sister-in-law, sister.in.law." Gao Jiging was frightened by her appearance and suddenly burst into a cold sweat. "Come on, come on. Come on, come on, come on." At this moment, he didn't care about anything else and rushed into the prison, frantically picking up the person lying on the ground and rushing towards the outside. I hope everyone likes the new article. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Avoiding Debt. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. Avoiding debt. It has just rained, and the already difficult road has become even more muddy and difficult to walk. In no time, the cloth shoes under my feet were covered in mud. The arduous journey weighed down one's willpower, and Su Weiqiu took a deep breath step by step, struggling to follow closely behind the Zhang family. After taking a few more steps, Zhang's feet slipped and she fell to the ground. Su Weiqiu quickly stepped forward to help her up. "Nyang, are you okay?" Seeing Zhang's face turn pale, Su Weiqiu couldn't help but look worried. "I'm fine," Zhang shook his head at her. The middle-aged man leading the horse in front stopped and frowned as he looked back. The person sitting on the carriage couldn't help but lift the curtain and ask, "Dad, why aren't you leaving? Keep up quickly." The middle-aged man waved at the two of them. "Master, we're all tired from walking. Can we take a break before leaving?" Zhang spoke cautiously to her husband ahead. Before Su Yan could speak, Su Xiaoke on the carriage immediately said with a dissatisfied expression, "How can we rest if we don't have a place in the village or a shop?" Su Weiqiu really couldn't stand her face of taking advantage and being obedient. He couldn't help but say to Su Yan, "Dad, my second mother and I have been walking for so long. Shouldn't it be time for us to get on the car instead?" As soon as she said this, everyone couldn't help but be stunned. No one expected that the words came from her mouth. Zhang raised her eyes and indeed saw her husband frowning and looking unhappy. She nervously grabbed Su Weiqiu's arm to signal her not to continue. Su Weiqiu ignored her and looked firmly at Su Yan. Su Yan was also feeling guilty when she stared at him like this. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. Just as he hesitated, a voice came from the carriage that was neither cold nor indifferent. "Master, our courier is wrapped in small feet and can't get off the ground." Upon hearing these words, an unnamed flame rose up. Su Weiqiu coldly replied to her, "She wrapped her little feet, auntie. You shouldn't have wrapped them up, right? Why can't you come down and walk? Give your seat to Nyang." Upon hearing this, Rome's face turned black and his tone immediately changed. "Sir, It's not that I don't want to go down, it's just that I twisted my foot and it hurts so hard, he said in the carriage. It's not certain whether it's a real injury or a fake injury, Su Weiqiu said in a low voice, but everyone present could hear it clearly. Su Xiaoke couldn't help but glance at her with a disdainful expression and said, "You guys are so dirty. You got up and dirty the car. Why don't you come down and walk on this road to see if you're dirty?" Seeing the two daughters arguing, Su Yan beside him appeared a bit impatient. All right, stop arguing. You two can bear it and walk another mile or two to find a place to rest." The carriage continued to move forward, only slowing down. Rong lifted a corner of the curtain and looked at the two people walking behind each other, with a hint of doubt on her face. I don't know if it's her illusion, but she always feels that the girl hasn't been as easy to handle as before. You know, in the past, she would never dare to say two things when she said one. Kuer, do you think Wei Qiu has been acting a bit abnormal lately? Upon Rong's question, Su Xiaoke's heart became even angrier. It's not normal. I'm afraid I fell and knocked my head out that day. I even learned to talk back, but who gave her the courage? Brother, how should we deal with her later? She turned her head and saw that Su Weiqing had already fallen asleep in front of her. It was said to be 1 or 2 miles away, but in reality, it took almost several more miles to see a village. Su Lian asked the farmer who was working in the field for water to drink. The farmer looked at them up and down and told him that there was a well at the end of the village where they could go to fetch water. After saying this, he casually asked, "Where are you going, buddy?" "We visit relatives." Upon hearing this answer, the farmer simply laughed it off. He was ignorant but not stupid. No one would walk with relatives like this, even carrying pots and pans. Entering the village, the group shamelessly borrowed accommodation from the villagers. There was a hospitable family who settled their entire family in a thatched cottage. For 6 people, this thatched cottage is a bit small, but it can also be considered as having a roof over their heads. At night, Su Weiqiu felt bored inside the house. He walked out the door to breathe and stood in the small courtyard, looking up at the starry sky, which was difficult to see in the 21st century. She is not Su Weiqiu, or rather this body is Su Weiqiu, but her soul comes from another world. There, she is Shenqing, a surgeon whose 28th birthday has just passed. The medical team she joined encountered a mudslide on her way to the countryside, and the vehicle was washed down the mountain. When the vehicle was severely impacted, what she thought to herself was, "It's over, it's really unfair." She worked hard to study and finally got into a medical university, followed by day and night learning, internships, various skill assessments, clinical assessments, and finally passed the 3 hurdles. She became a capable attending physician, but in the end, she would die young. Inside the carriage, a pair of arms extended towards her, and under the intense impact, Su Weiqiu hugged her tightly in fear. Before losing consciousness, Su Weiqiu was filled with unwillingness. I thought she was bound to die, but later she woke up and realized that she was no longer Shenqing, but Su Weiqiu, a 12-year-old girl from Chengqiao. This dynasty does not belong to any dynasty in the historical tide, but it does indeed exist. This body carries some memories of the original owner. Shenqing knew that Su Weiqiu, like herself, had no parental connection and died in childbirth when her biological mother gave birth to her. Without her mother's protection, she suffered from bullying and had a very weak personality. Her younger sister Su Xiaoke, who is 1 year younger than her, doesn't treat her like a person. She opens and closes her mouth, scolds, and punches and kicks at her. Su Weiqiu is afraid that this sister will be scared to death. Even if she hears her voice from afar, she has to hide. The ancestors of the Su family once produced Jiren, who also enjoyed great fame and left behind many industries. It's just that the younger generation is incompetent. By the time his father, Su Yan, was born, his family was already in decline. In the first few years, he was able to hold on to it, but later on, he had to gather and borrow land to make a living. The frequency of creditors coming to visit is increasing. In order to avoid debt, the head of the Su family, Zhao Yan, and his family left Yucheng overnight. Their goal is to return to Mazhou. Although Mazhou is not as prosperous as Yucheng, there is at least an old house there. On the way, Su Xiaoke wrongly accused Su Weiqiu of stealing her things. To prove his innocence, Su Weiqiu jumped down from the cliff, and under such an opportunity, Shen Qingqing became Su Weiqiu. When she first woke up, her body was very weak. It was her second mother, Zhang, who fed her to life with a spoonful of soup. Shen Qing's parents divorced when she was young. Before the age of 6, her parents had already reorganized their families, and the two of them ignored her. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Housemaid. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Housemaid. She was a child who grew up on her grandfather's farm. His grandfather was an expert in planting and breeding, with an honest and introverted personality. Although he never lacked her clothing or food, it was just that. Zhang is delicate and considerate, taking meticulous care of his stepdaughter who saved her life. Shen Qing, who has never felt family affection since childhood, felt it in Zhang. This Zhang family was a tenant of Su Yan. They came from a better family background than the Rong family and had a son. Unfortunately, they passed away before a month, and since then, they have had nothing to do. As a result, the concubine Rong, who had a son and a daughter, gradually became arrogant. Today, there is no place for her to stand in the Su family. Under the moonlight, Su Weiqiu strolled around the messy courtyard for a while. Just a few steps away, he heard a sound of voices coming from ahead. As he approached, he saw Rong and two women whispering in the corner. She didn't pay attention and turned her head back. After sitting down in the cabin for a while, Rong Shi led the two women in. Su Yan looked puzzled and asked, "What's wrong?" Rong didn't beat around the bush and said directly, "Master, there is a resident surnamed Lu in this village who wants to buy a maid for a whole house. I think Wei Qiu is quite suitable." Upon hearing these words, Zhang's face showed a hint of anxiety, and he reached out and tightly grasped Su Weiqiu's hand. But one of the women in green looked around the small house, her gaze fixed on Su Weiqiu and Shen Xiaoke, and asked, "Which one is it?" Rong pointed to Su Weiqiu. The woman saw this and showed a hint of dissatisfaction on her face. "This girl is too thin and weak to support." Rong quickly said, "Don't look at her appearance. She has a lot of strength, and she works quickly and eats less." Su Weiqiu, standing beside her, couldn't help but laugh and cry. She never imagined that one day she would be traded in front of someone like a livestock, weighing according to weight. "Dad, I'm not going." She immediately expressed her position. Before Su Yan could speak, Rong Shi walked over and took her hand, saying with a painstaking expression, "Wei Qiu, don't think your aunt is harming you. You see, our family's resources are almost exhausted, and we've had a long and arduous journey. We've had one meal before and we haven't had the next. Whether we can survive to Mazhou is still uncertain. I've inquired, and Lu is a wealthy man with a large family. If you used to work as a maid for someone, as long as you work hard and quickly, they won't treat you unfairly. In a few years, let the master find a good family to marry for you. It's not better than following us on a long journey." Rong didn't think she was lying either. Their expenses were indeed limited, and if they continued like this, they would have to use her little personal money. It was something she had finally saved up, and spending every penny would cost her life. Although this dead girl didn't eat much along the way, after all, having multiple people and mouths would be a burden. She had long thought of leaving her behind. If she could still sell it to a wealthy family for a few dollars, wouldn't it be like killing two birds with one stone? Su Weiqiu looked at Rong Shi's pretentious face and thought to himself that this would replace the weak, ignorant, and bossy Su Weiqiu who used to be. He must have been sold in such a confused way. She snorted coldly and said, "Auntie, who are you fooling? You know what this maidservant does in your heart, it's someone who specializes in serving men at night. If the master has guests, you have to provide them with entertainment, and they don't live as well as the girls in the kiln. Who will be fooled by the master's finding a good family in 2 years? From ancient times to the present, how many maidservants who serve as maidservants can have a good ending? Upon hearing these words, Zhang was so frightened that tears welled up in her eyes. She came from a small family and only knew how to earn labor by being a maid. How could she know there were still such dirty things to do? Isn't this supposed to push people into the fire pit? With this in mind, Zhang mustered up the courage to speak to Zhao Yan, who was not far away, and said, "Master, I dare not. You can't be so ruthless. Qiu is your eldest daughter." Rong quickly refuted and said, "What legitimate illegitimate? When is it that we still pay attention to this now? Being able to sell to wealthy families is also her fate. As a concubine, she is able to dominate the main wife in everything, not only because she has a strong belly, but also because of her strong personality." Sure enough, as soon as she spoke, Zhang immediately dared not speak again. Zhang was afraid of her, but Su Weiqiu refused. She retorted coldly, "Auntie, since this is fate, why don't you let Su Xiaoke go?" Su Xiaoke, who was originally gloating on the side, immediately changed her face upon hearing her words and cursed at her with open teeth and claws. "Su Weiqiu, don't be shameless, you damn girl. If you keep talking nonsense, see if I don't tear your mouth apart." Seeing his father frown and look over, Su Weiqing beside him was very clever, reaching out to cover his sister's mouth and taking the person out. "Old master. If not, let's sell the horse," Zhang stuttered and suggested. Upon hearing this, Zhao Yan couldn't help but shake his sleeve and curse, "A woman's view." After hearing these words, Rong Shi also showed a look of disdain. "That horse is the only remaining property of our Su family. If we sell it, what will happen to our belongings? Can't you carry it on the road?" Seeing the family arguing uncontrollably, the woman in green gave a glance to her companions next to her. The two of them pretended that they couldn't make a decision for the time being and asked the head of the family to come and take a look before making any plans. After leaving a message, the two of them hurriedly left. Seeing this, Zhang breathed a sigh of relief and found an opportunity. She quietly stepped forward to comfort Su Weiqiu, saying that they might think she was too thin and weak to meet the requirements, and it was estimated that this transaction would not be possible. Su Weiqiu, however, was not as optimistic as Nyang. Since Rong Shi had decided to sell her, even if the deal did not succeed this time, it was difficult to guarantee that there would be no second chance. You should know that in this patriarchal society, once a woman sells herself into slavery, it is even harder for her to have freedom. Instead of feeling anxious all the way, it's better to withdraw early. In this era of relative material scarcity, it is indeed difficult for a woman to survive, but Su Weiqiu firmly believes that it should not be a problem to support herself with her own knowledge. She has always had a personality of doing whatever she says. That night, when the Su family fell asleep, she hurriedly packed her bags and quietly left the village. In the darkness, she chose a mountain road, but due to the slippery road on rainy days, it was not easy to walk. When she reached a steep stone wall, she almost stumbled. Fortunately, she was agile and managed to avoid the danger. Unexpectedly, before walking too far, I heard a burst of painful cries coming from behind. In the middle of the night, the sound almost didn't send her away. "Autumn! Autumn!" It was the voice of Nyang that shook Su Weiqiu's heart. She quickly rushed back and walked not far. Under the moonlight, she saw Zhang Shi lying under the steep wall, looking disheveled. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Gu Huang Mountain. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Gu Huang Mountain. She knew that Zhang was very timid, afraid of people and ghosts day and night. She had to muster up a lot of courage to dare to chase after him in this dark night. Nyang, why did you keep up? She lowered her waist and slid down the stone wall. Seeing her approaching, Zhang Shi reached out and grabbed the corner of her clothes, pleading bitterly, "Chior, come back with me. In this cannibalistic world, how can you live as a girl? Don't be afraid. Although Yang is useless, I will never let that person surnamed Rong sell you." Under the moonlight, the woman's pleading gaze moved Su Weiqiu. Zhang's tears welled up in her eyes when she didn't respond. Su Weiqiu's heart softened and he couldn't help but nod in agreement. "Okay, second mother, I won't leave." She reached out to help Zhang Shi and said, "Let's go back." Unexpectedly, with a little force, Zhang Shi frowned and exclaimed in pain, "Chior, I can't get up anymore, my leg seems to be twisted." "Let me see." Su Weiqiu helped her sit down and gently pressed her hand somewhere. Zhang cried out in pain. Seeing this, Su Weiqiu's face changed at dawn. Zhang was carried into the cottage by two farmers, and when Rong saw her appearance, she exclaimed to be guilty. Zhang's injured leg had already been fixed with a splint, which was clearly handled by a dedicated person. Seeing Su Lian's puzzled face, Su Weiqiu explained, "Along the way, a kind-hearted doctor happened to pass by, and he bandaged Yang." Upon hearing her words, Zhang's face looked a bit strange. Although she had personally bandaged her leg, why did she panic and claim that it was done by the doctor? Also, the skillful technique she used to bandage herself just now is beyond the reach of ordinary people. She never knew that her stepdaughter had such skills. Su Weiqiu avoided her inquisitive gaze and added, "The doctor has instructed that Yang needs to rest in bed for a month, otherwise her leg will be broken." What? Upon hearing these words, Rong couldn't calm down anymore. She tugged at her throat and shouted, "For a month. Yes, 1 month, not a day can be missed. No, even if we delay for a day on the way, it will be money. Not to mention a month, we can't wait for 2 days. What do you think, sir?" Upon hearing these words, Zhang was deeply afraid of being abandoned and was immediately frightened to tears. Su Lian stood there, looking at this and that, unable to make up his mind for a moment. Rong continued, "With so many of us, why do we have to spend $5 a month on food and clothing? How can we have so much idle money now?" Su Weiqiu couldn't bear to listen anymore and couldn't help but say, "Don't worry, as long as you promise not to leave Yang alone here, I'll figure out a solution for these 5 hanging coins." Just because of this one sentence, 3 days later, Su Weiqiu changed into Su Weiqing's clothes and followed a group of strong men to Mount Huang, which was 20 kilometers away. Before leaving, Rong Shi even took off the cloth shoes under her feet and gave her a pair of poorly made grass shoes. If it weren't for fear that her life as a second mother would be difficult, Su Weiqiu would really want to come forward and have a fight with her. "There are nearly 100 people accompanying us, all of whom are males, including the elderly, strong middle-aged people, and more young people in their teens and 20s. There are only 4 people like Su Weiqiu, who is 12 or 13 years old in size. On the way, due to his similar age, a young man named Gooden always came over to chat with Su Weiqiu. Su Weiqiu pretended to be on the mountain, so he was afraid of revealing his true identity and secretly glanced at the official leading the way not far away, so he dared not speak up much. However, this dog egg is a chatterbox. With just one reply, the other person can chatter more than 10 sentences. On the way, Su Weiqiu learned from Gooden that Huang Mountain is a famous feng shui treasure land with stunning scenery. They only know that they have been arranged to go up the ancient Phoenix Mountain, but no one knows exactly what work they need to do there. If it's a beautiful place with beautiful scenery, it would be quite nice. Along the way, they climbed mountains, crossed mountains, and waded through water. When the group arrived at their destination, the scenery in front of them made everyone dumbfounded. Where did this picturesque scenery come from? The vast and endless Huang Mountain has already been dug up to the point where it is unrecognizable, and many places have already built high walls. Amidst the rolling dust, all one can see are magnificent laborers, probably thousands of them. The vastness of the project in front of Su Weiqiu might have mistaken it for the construction of the Great Wall if he had not known that it was the Chengqiao period. Dog Egg, standing behind her, saw this scene and said to her with a mournful face, "Little fish, I don't want to stay here anymore. I want to go home." However, before he could finish speaking, the officials rushed them into the factory. Soon, these 100 people were dispersed and assigned to work in various districts. Here, after sunrise and sunset, I rest in the adobe house at the foot of the mountain, day after day. At first, Su Weiqiu was worried that her daughter might not be able to cover up, but she soon realized that she was too worried. The workload here was too heavy, and no one would have the energy to pay attention to a yellow-haired boy who didn't even grow hair. Under the scorching sun, on Mount Huang, people work like ants. Moving sand and stones, digging foundations, transporting wood and stone materials. Even young and strong people find it difficult to work with such high intensity. Su Weiqiu has just arrived and doesn't know how to slack off when it comes to work. After working hard for a few days, she already feels that her body can't take it anymore. At night, the surroundings were snoring like thunder. Su Weiqiu curled up in a corner of the thatched cottage, groaning softly. Her hands and feet were scratched in many places, and due to the weight, the pain in both shoulder bones was unbearable. Even a slight touch would cause a piercing pain. The next day, at dawn, the whistle for construction sounded like a soul-stirring sound. She struggled and followed everyone into the factory, starting a day of hard work. The backpack full of gravel pressed against her shoulder, and Su Weiqiu couldn't help but let out a painful scream. The uncle beside him couldn't help but ask, "Are you okay?" Su Weiqiu shook his head with a bitter face. The other party couldn't help but feel pity for her young and small stature, so they casually removed 2 large stones from her backpack to lighten her burden. Just as they were about to unload the third one, they saw a supervisor turn his head and look towards her. The uncle was frightened and quickly stopped. In this workshop, people are also divided into 3, 6, or 9 levels. In addition to the official guards on the periphery, there are also many tasks responsible for supervising the construction site. And the laborers who work as laborers are also divided into different levels, with some paid craftsmen, most of whom are Yao laborers who are forced to go up the mountain like her. There is also a relatively special group, which is the criminals. Prisoners, as the name suggests, are those prisoners who have committed crimes and are released to serve in the mountains. They were all dressed in prison uniforms, handcuffed with heavy chains at their feet, driven to work like walking corpses. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. The Living King of Hell. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. The Living King of Hell. The overseers here do not treat these criminals as human beings at all, and if they are slightly dissatisfied, they may even insult and beat them. Heavy punishment tools are used in battle, and it is said that many have died as a result. Seeing that the supervisor was no longer paying attention, Su Weiqiu turned around and thanked the uncle, gritting his teeth and walking forward step by step. After walking for a short distance, it was difficult for her to step forward. Under the scorching sun, she stood there, sweating incessantly on her forehead, and the heavy backpack weighed down on her, making it almost impossible for her to catch her breath. She gritted her teeth and walked a short distance, unable to hold her breath anymore. She bent down and just put down her backpack. A shadow shrouded her, and she looked up with a wrong expression, only to see the supervisor who had been paying attention to her just now standing in front of her, looking at her. Su Weiqiu's heart panicked and he lowered his head, struggling to pick up his backpack again. The supervisor reached out to stop her and asked, "Are you new here?" Yes. The other party frowned and looked at her, then muttered to himself, "Are you a corvée worker? Is this little body old enough?" Upon hearing these words, Su Weiqiu's heart immediately sounded an alarm. If he was found to be impersonating someone else to serve corvée, he would be sentenced to imprisonment. "Are you 14 years old?" According to the laws of the Qing dynasty, corvées must be at least 14 years old. I just turned 14 this year, and my family is poor. I often can't eat, and I grow slower than my peers, she replied nervously. The other party nodded at the words and didn't ask further questions. They just said, "Put down the things and go dig sand over there." Seeing that he not only did not discipline himself, but also assigned himself a relatively easy task, Su Weiqiu breathed a sigh of relief and thanked him repeatedly. So, she worked on the battlefield for half a month, and was assigned by another steward to transport wood. Each piece of wood was made of top-quality nanmu. If it were in the era of her previous life, the eye-catching nanmu could be said to be priceless. The wood was thick and long, requiring a high level of cooperation from the movers. Su Weiqiu, who was small in stature and had not worked as a steward for 2 days, felt that she was not suitable and was reassigned to move the stones. This time she went to the stone quarry in the east, where the stones were even larger than what she had previously transported. After arriving at the quarry, Su Weiqiu secretly complained in her heart. However, she was soon surprised to find that although these stones were difficult to move, they were no longer as deadly as before. She joked to herself. Perhaps it was after a period of tempering that her skin became rough and her flesh became thick. Why stop and dawdle around trying to be lazy? Hurry up, hurry up. Hurry up. Upon hearing the shouting behind him, Su Weiqiu quickly quickened his pace, but he didn't take 2 steps. He stepped on a pointed hard object, which didn't feel like gravel on the mountain. She bent down and dug out something from the gravel. Upon inspection, it turned out to be a piece of iron, the size of a thumb, with rust on the surface. She turned her head and looked around, calmly putting the iron sheet into her pocket. The stones were being moved one by one, and it was unclear how much time had passed. Su Weiqiu felt a dry mouth and a bitter taste in her mouth. Just as she stopped to take a sip of water, she suddenly heard a noisy noise coming from afar. As the sound got closer, the working crowd turned to avoid each other. Quickly, a tall black horse came in a gust of wind, and wherever it passed, a rolling gust of dust rose up. Su Weiqiu stared blankly at the bright white color on the horse's back, lost in thought. The soldiers here are wearing gray uniforms, and the supervisors, who are dressed in more glamorous clothes, are also dressed in uniform black. Among these hard-working laborers who work day and night, none of them are messy, and their clothes are all black without their original appearance. Perhaps Weiqiu herself had been unable to take a shower for 10.5 days and a month since she went up to Mount Huang, feeling disheveled. She knew that her image was no different from that of African refugees at this moment. It can be said that the entire Huang mountain is dark and lifeless. The sudden bright white color on the horse's back doesn't captivate people. "Oh my goodness, the living king of hell has returned," someone whispered beside him. Su Weiqiu didn't pay attention to the meaning in these words, her eyes closely following the dusty center. This was the first time she had seen someone galloping on a horse since she arrived in this world. Unlike the thin horse of the Su family, which is no different from a mule, what is in front of me is a majestic horse, and the person on the horse's back is full of energy and authority. After galloping wildly on the mountain, he stopped at a high place. Su Weiqiu stared absent-mindedly at the celestial immortal figure in the distance, not noticing where his gaze was. Everyone lowered their heads and dared not look at him. In an instant, the person on the horse's back caught their legs and quickly flew away, leaving behind rolling dust flying everywhere. "What are you looking at? Hurry up and start working." A supervisor nearby pushed her forward, and Su Weiqiu regained his senses. However, when he lowered his head, he saw that his tools were nowhere to be found. Here, even without tools, she still had to do some work, so she started digging sand and stones with her bare hands. The person next to her criticized her slow movements and impatiently reached out to push her, saying, "Go over there, don't get in the way here." Su Weiqiu had to move aside. The location was relatively open, with several prisoners wearing handcuffs working. These people were usually arranged to work in another area, in order to isolate themselves from others and facilitate management. But for some reason, many prisoners have been arranged to come here recently. The supervisors are keeping a close eye on these criminals, and they usually have their place, and other laborers are not willing to get too close. Su Weiqiu didn't care about this, he bent down and started working hard there. The prisoner standing beside her was tall and thin. Seeing her digging for gravel with her bare hands, her 10 fingers were all scratched by the sand and stones, so he handed the shovel in his hand to her. Su Weiqiu hesitated for a moment when she saw the shovel and reached out to pick it up. As she looked up, she was shocked by the long scar on the other person's face. She was stunned for a moment before saying softly, "Thank you." The other party lowered their eyes and glanced at her without making a sound, then turned around to continue working. Looking at the shovel in his hand, Su Weiqiu glanced at the tall and thin back not far away and the heavy iron chain on his feet. His heart was filled with mixed feelings. At the end of the evening, Su Weiqiu stood in line with a bowl to cook. When it was her turn, she frowned at the 2 coarse grain mantou in the bowl. Aren't there 4 mantou for each person? Even the congee water in the bowl is only half that of others. The cook who cooked for her was fat and strong. Faced with her objections, she glared at her with a displeased expression and said, "You're so small, eating 2 is enough." End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Young Master. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Young Master. Not enough, I have a big appetite. Upon hearing the voices of the 2 arguing, the cook from the other team turned her head and glanced into her bowl. "Give me 2 more, Su Weiqiu said. "How much work can a yellow-haired boy do? Having you to eat is already considered good. Walk and walk, don't stand in this way. You're so unfair." It's not that she wants to make trouble. It's really a day of physical work. At the moment, she is hungry, and 2 mantou must not be enough. However, before she could argue with her, the fat cook impatiently tapped the pot wall with a spoon and shouted loudly, "Next." The people queuing up from behind rushed forward eagerly, and under the pushing and shoving, Su Weiqiu, who was thin and weak, was quickly pushed aside. Knowing that if she went up again, the other party would definitely not admit it, Su Weiqiu felt a bit frustrated. She hung her head and turned around to leave. After only taking a few steps, someone patted her shoulder from behind. Looking back, there was another cook standing behind, of medium height, with kind eyebrows and eyes. Without saying a word, the other party put 2 mantou in her bowl and said, "You can line up with me later." Su Weiqiu was stunned for a while before spitting out 2 words. "Thank you." The cook glanced at her and turned around to leave. Su Weiqiu quickly called her and said, "Wait, auntie, what should I call you?" "My husband's surname is Chen." Leaving behind this sentence, the cook hurriedly left. The coarse grains were hard and dry to swallow, but she was extremely hungry, and she quickly ate them all with the half bowl of congee water. Subsequently, she quietly arrived at a dark and deserted place to take a nap. As soon as she lifted her pants, she heard a chaotic sound of footsteps coming from behind. Su Weiqiu was startled and quickly shrank down to hide in the bushes. "This way, hurry up." Accompanied by a low voice, several figures sneaked over from afar and passed by the bushes where Su Weiqiu was. In the moonlight, several unfamiliar faces flashed past her, and the large prison characters on her tattered clothes were very prominent. Su Weiqiu held her breath, afraid to take a breath, until she saw a familiar scar on a certain face, and her heart couldn't help but tug. Until several escaped prisoners walked away, she quietly walked out of the bushes and cautiously turned back along the original path with a nervous heart. Just as she arrived at the adobe house, someone patted her shoulder behind her. Su Weiqiu was still immersed in what she had just seen, and with such a slap, she suddenly turned back in shock and fear. The other party was also startled by her fierce response and quickly spoke up, "Little fish, it's my dog Egg. What's wrong with you?" Looking at the familiar face that had been missing for a long time, Su Weiqiu patted his chest in shock and said, "Dog Egg, you scared me." What's wrong? Dog Egg looked at her with a puzzled expression. The scarred face flashed through her mind as she shook her head and said, "It's okay, Dog Egg. Why are you here?" "I've been looking for you all along." Dog Egg affectionately reached out and grabbed her shoulder. Su Weiqiu did not resist and raised her hand to pat the other person's arm. After all, she was also happy to see a familiar face again in such a place. "I've been looking for you for a long time, but I haven't seen you yet." Su Weiqiu nodded at the words and said, "There are too many people here, it's really not easy to meet them." The two of them sat on a stone 2 zhang away from the adobe house and chatted. After more than a month of honing, Gooden's smile on his face has decreased, but his nagging nature has not changed. In just a short column of incense, Su Weiqiu already knows where he has been assigned to do what work. Dog Egg chattered for a while, but when he arrived, he let out a long sigh and said with great emotion, "If I had known that coming here would suffer so much, I would have asked my dad to pay someone to come on my behalf. In fact, my family still has some money, and I am the only male servant at home. My dad is too stingy and values money more than anything else. What about you, little fish? You look even smaller than me, are you also the only child in the family? Otherwise, how would it be your turn to come here?" Su Weiqiu had a bitter smile on her face. She came to replace someone else, and she was not sure if this person surnamed Yu was the only child. At first, the Yu family was interested in her brother Su Weiqing, but Su Weiqing spared his life. Su Weiqiu knew that even if he was willing, Rongshe would not agree. She gave the other person a seemingly ambiguous answer with a gentle hum. Dog Egg didn't really want to know the answer when he asked, but when he heard her respond, he suddenly changed his tone and said, "Did you see someone riding a horse into the mountain at noon today?" Su Weiqiu recalled the startled glance and nodded lightly, I saw it." Dog Egg continued with a face full of excitement, "Do you know who the person riding on the horse is? I heard it's the young master here, and they all say he's amazing." As he spoke, he couldn't help but sigh. "I see his posture on horseback, it's really impressive." After hearing these words, Su Weiqiu said disapprovingly, "I don't think he's old enough. Where can he be so powerful?" However, within a day of speaking these words, Su Weiqiu had already truly experienced the power of this young master. Dawn broke in the sky, and everyone in the workshop was already working hard. At noon, the young master appeared again. As soon as he dismounted, a group of eunuchs quickly gathered behind him. Upon closer inspection, Su Weiqiu realized that this person was really young and his appearance was quite stunning. However, as soon as this person arrived, the atmosphere of the entire workshop immediately became solemn. He stood there looking around and spoke coldly, "Don't even do it." As soon as these words were spoken, the surrounding supervisors began to order everyone to stop. Soon, all the criminals in the entire area were taken to one place. Other laborers dared not take any action and silently stood by with their hands down. The air was filled with a sense of solemnity, and the surroundings fell into a dead silence. The young master held a whip and silently circled around the group of criminals before stopping. "Bring the people up," he said with a hint of coldness in his voice. Quickly, the two prisoners were brought up to him by the soldiers and knelt on the ground. As soon as the two of them knelt down, the man didn't say a word and the whip in his hand greeted them. The sound of the whip hitting the flesh sounded, 1, 2, 3 times. The sound of whipping was accompanied by screams of agony, and the sound of ghosts crying and wolves howling made people shudder. The onlookers on the side were all trembling with fear when they saw the situation, and no one dared to make a sound. Su Weiqiu was also shocked. This young master appeared to be only 17 or 8 years old, and his violent aura was so heavy. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Getting Whipped. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Getting whipped. If she had taken a short video and posted it online in the world where she lived in her previous life, this kind of abuse of prisoners would have caused over 1 billion citizens to drown him with just a mouthful of saliva. As she was rehearsing in her mind, suddenly an elderly man in prison uniform rushed forward, hugging the man's leg and pleading with him, "Sir, sir, the child is guilty, the child is guilty. Please give him a way to live and spare him." The man stopped, and just as Su Weiqiu thought he had a sympathetic heart, he coldly blurted out 2 words from his mouth. "Let go." The elder was taken aback and then released his hand in fear. The beautiful white brocade was covered in a large amount of dirt, and the man frowned with a look of disgust. The next moment, he raised his foot and kicked the old man hard in the face. The old man let out a painful cry before falling to the ground. The scene in front of Su Weiqiu made her unable to calm down anymore. She was furious and wanted to move forward, but the dog egg beside her quickly stopped her and said, "What do you want to do? You don't want to live anymore." Although dog egg suppressed the sound, the slightest movement did not escape the ears of the abuser. Zhao Yan turned his head to look towards the sound source. Quickly, he saw a pair of bright eyes with a hint of anger in his grimy face, and also understood the meaning behind it. Here, no one has ever dared to look at himself with such eyes, as if he could see through everything, which made Zhao Yan very unhappy. He strode over and without saying a word, raised the whip in his hand. When Su Weiqiu saw the whip coming towards her, he quickly turned his back and the horse whip hit her hard on the back. With the sound of her flesh cracking, a hot and piercing pain ran straight from her back to her brain. Su Weiqiu gritted his back teeth tightly. This personal pain quickly made her realize her situation. She had died once and was finally reborn. Although she was in this terrible dynasty, she still cherished her life. It is obvious that the man in front of him, although young, is the boss of the factory. Here, he can cover the sky with one hand, and his own life is like an ant to this person. At the moment, it was crucial to save his life. After taking a whip, Su Weiqiu endured the pain and dared not repeat it, slowly prostrating himself at the opponent's feet. Zhao Yan knew the power of his whip, but when he saw this troublemaker being whipped by himself at a young age, he could still hold back and remain silent. He snorted coldly and said, "You're a tough guy, lift your head up." Su Weiqiu obediently raised her head, her whole face mixed with sweat and dust, her disheveled face unsightly, but her eyes were very lively. This beetle has developed a pair of good eyes, and Zhao Yan stared at those eyes for a moment before asking. "What's your name?" "The villain's surname is Yu." Zhao Yan nodded and stared at her for a while before turning around and leaving. The elder, who had been kicked to the ground, trembled and stood up, then knelt down again. Zhao Yan glanced at him indifferently and spoke coldly, "I want you to know that I am a person with clear rewards and punishments. If I make a mistake, I will be punished. Come on." He pointed to the prisoner and said, "Each person is rewarded with 10 boards." The officials quickly surrounded a group of prisoners, and soon, screams of agony echoed from the workshop. As the saying goes, punishment does not hold the public accountable. When it comes to clear rewards and punishments, it is clear that this person is just finding an excuse to act recklessly. With Su Weiqiu as a warning from the past, everyone dared not speak out when they saw this scene. "Here, I'll give you a big one." When Aunt Chen saw Su Weiqiu, she specially selected a big red potato and handed it to her bowl. As he looked up, he saw that the other person's face was different. He couldn't help but ask, "What's wrong with you? Is there something uncomfortable?" Su Weiqiu shook his head and said, "I'm fine, thank you, Auntie." After thanking Aunt Chen, she slowly turned around holding her rice bowl. Although her clothes were dirty and old, the whip marks with blood marks on her back were still clearly visible. It seems that this child has been beaten, and his thin body looks pitiful. Mrs. Chen couldn't help but take a few more glances, until someone urged her to quickly calm down and continue to cook. Su Weiqiu left the crowd and sat down in front of Dog Egg. Every move she made was careful, and her arms were not afraid to move around. With just a gentle pull on her muscles, there was a sharp pain coming from behind. Dog Egg looked at her and felt very uncomfortable for her. "Are you okay? Do you want to find a doctor to take medicine?" "I don't know if there is a doctor here." Su Weiqiu shook his head and said, "It's okay. As long as the wound doesn't touch water or become inflamed, it will heal soon." Recalling the scene at noon in the factory, Gooden still had lingering palpitations. He let out a long sigh and said, "The young master, who looks like a fairy, never expected to be so cruel." Su Weiqiu tugged at the corner of his mouth and said, "You can't judge a person by their appearance. Those scumbags have to hide far away when they see them in the future in order to protect themselves wisely." This is meant for Dog Dan to listen to, and it is also a warning to oneself. We can't afford to provoke that kind of big shot either. As he spoke, Dog Egg glanced left and right, leaned over to Su Weiqiu's ear, and Su Weiqiu reflexively dodged for a moment, only to hear him sneakily say, "I heard that several prisoners escaped last night, and a group of soldiers searched the mountains all night without finding anything. That's why the young master was so angry. If someone can catch them, it's okay. If they can't catch them, the others will still suffer." Su Weiqiu didn't think so. The manager was so cruel, and if those people were caught, they might not even be able to save their lives. She couldn't help but think of the scarred face and the hand that handed her the shovel. It was a kind person, but she didn't know what had happened. At night, Su Weiqiu lay on a wooden board. Although his body was extremely tired, he couldn't sleep at night. The whiplash on her back tormented her, and she snored like thunder in her ears. She leaned over and glanced at the uncle who was sleeping like a dead pig not far away, feeling envious in her heart. In the darkness, she took out a piece of iron from her arms, which she had previously found in the mountains. The rust on the iron had been polished off by her, revealing a smooth surface. She compared the size of a piece of iron with her thumb, and then took out a similarly sized turquoise stone from her pocket, grinding it slowly. Someone was woken up by the sound and scolded. "Who's grinding his teeth? It's so noisy that nobody can sleep." After scolding, he turned over and fell asleep again. Under the scorching sun, Su Weiqiu struggled to climb a small slope with a basket of stones on his back. When he looked up, he saw a bird passing over his head. Under the blue sky and white clouds, the posture of soaring freely was desirable. Su Weiqiu couldn't help but take a few more glances, until a urging whistle sounded from behind, before she could calm her mind. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Say Kill and Kill. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Say Kill and Kill. The bird circled in the air for a while, flying at lightning speed towards the east. That is a well-trained carrier pigeon, passing through a jungle. It flew low over the lake and had just entered a bamboo forest before being pierced by a bow and arrow. The flying pigeon pounced and immediately plummeted vertically from high altitude. A moment later, a man wearing a blue official uniform approached. He bent down, grabbed the arrow pole, and unloaded the paper from the carrier pigeon's feet. He casually threw the carrier pigeon to the ground, turned around, and ran wildly along the horse path in the forest. This is a small forest separated from Huang Mountain by a hill. Compared to the unrecognizable Huang Mountain, it has dense bamboo forests, clear lake water, and picturesque scenery. At the foot of the mountain and by the lake, there is a large building that faces north and south, built along the mountain and water. The house is a courtyard-style structure with 3 entrances and 3 exits. Although it is not grand, pavilions, towers, pools, pavilions, and water pavilions are all intact. In the yard, a servant was holding a broom and cleaning up fallen leaves. Although it was already summer, the mountain breeze blew through and it was not cool enough. Everything is good here, except for a tall tree growing next to the yard. Although it has lush branches and leaves, its fruits are small and abundant. When the wind blows, the fruits fall into the yard with a crackling sound. This is not a big deal, but their master is someone who loves cleanliness. In order not to disturb their eyes, he has to come here every 1 or 2 hours to clean up. Some fruits have been trampled to the ground and are difficult to clean, so the servant had to squat down and use the small shovel in his hand to shovel them. As he was tinkering with it, he saw a young man dressed in servant attire hurriedly walking past him, holding a delicate clay jar in his hand. Chang Gung recognized that it was Zhao Kai, the close follower of the master, who was also a servant. However, he was a popular figure around the master, and he only had to play with the master every day. There was no need to work hard like himself, working tirelessly in the dark. Seeing Zhao Kai bow and knocking on the door with the earthen jar in his hand, Chang Gung couldn't help but curl his lips, thinking to himself. I'm afraid this flatterer didn't get another little thing from somewhere to please the master. Driven by curiosity, he held a broom and pretended to sweep the floor while strolling under the eaves. With his gaze peeking through the window paper, Chang Gung couldn't help but be slightly stunned. He had been in the yard all along, and at some point, there was an extra person inside the house. Zhao Yan lazily lay on his recliner, holding a string of Buddhist beads in his left hand and a paper fan in his right hand, flapping non-stop. A servant knelt on the ground 1 foot away from him, holding a clay jar in both hands. Zhao Yan glanced faintly at the earthen jar and fixed his gaze on a man wearing a blue official uniform and not far away. He slowly spoke up and asked, Meng Qi, have you found it? Meng Qi stood with his hand down and nodded at him, yes. As he spoke, he handed a note to Zhao Yan. Zhao Yan reached out to take it, unfolded the note, and glanced lightly at the content. As he put away the note, he opened his mouth and yawned heavily. Then, he turned his head slightly and looked at the servant beside him with his slender eyes. Under his gaze, the servant kowtowing to the ground was sweating profusely. Zhao Kai, Zhao Yan called out softly. As soon as he spoke, Zhao Kai's hands trembled uncontrollably, and the jar in his hand made a creaking sound amidst his uncontrollable shaking. Yes. Yes. The little one is here. What good thing did you just say you brought me? Zhao Kai slowly lifted his head and shook his hands as he opened the lid of the earthen jar. This is a small cricket that I just caught on the mountain. Master. Master, you see, it's big enough, with thick and long legs, and straight tentacles. 1. It's definitely good at fighting. Is that right? Zhao Yan stood up and slowly leaned towards him, saying with a smile, raise it up a bit, let me see. Upon hearing this, Zhao Kai held the earthen jar high above his head. He looked up at Zhao Yan, who was close at hand, struggling to calm down, but his hands trembled uncontrollably. Zhao Yan squinted his eyes and glanced into the jar, his smile on the corner of his mouth condensing. He shook his head and whispered, I don't think this little thing is very good either. As he spoke, he heard a clang, and a silver light flashed in front of Zhao Kai's eyes. The next moment, there was a sharp pain in his abdomen. He lowered his head and looked down. At some point, the sword that was originally in the waist of Deputy Meng Qi had deeply penetrated his abdomen. And the person holding the sword hilt is his master. Zhao Yan. Master. Zhao Kai shouted with difficulty, and his sword was drawn out. A mouthful of blood spurted out from the corner of his mouth. With a clang, the earthen jar fell to the ground and shattered into thin pieces. A cricket with a beautiful appearance bounced up from it and disappeared in the blink of an eye. Chang Gung, who was outside the house, was so scared that he collapsed on the ground, afraid of making a sound. He covered his mouth tightly with both hands. He had long known that his master was behaving recklessly and not easy to serve, but he never expected to be so cruel. It was only because of a small cricket that he killed his attendants who had been serving on both sides. Zhao Kai collapsed into a pool of blood on the ground with a face full of death, blood flowing on the clean ground. Zhao Yan glanced at his hand, which was stained with a few drops of splattered blood. Meng Qi saw a look of disgust in Zhao Yan's eyes and quickly took the sword from his hand and handed him a handkerchief. Zhao Yan wiped his hands with a handkerchief. Seeing him looking at the dirt on the ground, Meng Qi quickly said, "Your Excellency, hold back for a while. I will order someone to come and clean it up." He turned around and was about to take a step away when suddenly he remembered something and couldn't help but turn around to ask for advice. Zhao Kai has passed away, and there is a shortage of close attendants around the adults. I will now send a message to inform the steward Qi to arrange for a useful person to come up the mountain from the mansion. Zhao Yan was about to nod in agreement when suddenly a pair of impressive eyes flashed through his mind. After being whipped by himself, the beetle did learn well, but he was confident that there was no wrong meaning in the eyes he saw at first glance. There is disgust and more criticism. It's quite interesting. Staying in this place where birds don't poop for a long time, he's bored to the point of going crazy. Since I am idle anyway, it seems quite good to find this troublemaker to entertain myself. Thinking of this, Zhao Yanni felt like a 3-year-old child discovering a new toy, and his whole body became excited. As soon as he took a sip of water, the whistle for the gathering sounded. Su Weiqiu quickly put down the kettle in his hand and lined up with the others. A supervisor stood at the front of the team silently observing them. It's not a good thing to gather crowds every time in the factory, and I don't know what's going on this time. Everyone couldn't help but become nervous until the supervisor called out directly to the team, Uxin is out. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. You're lucky, kid. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. You're lucky, kid. Everyone looks at me and I look at you, but no one makes a sound. The supervisor patiently called out again, "Who is Uxin?" Su Weiqiu didn't react at all. Instead, Gooden, who was standing behind him, reached out and pushed her, saying, "Little fish, didn't he call you?" Su Weiqiu suddenly realized that Uxin was herself, feeling a chill in her heart. She didn't have time to think deeply, so she had to step out of the team. The supervisor walked over to look at her and couldn't help but frown. "Are you Uxin?" "As for adults, yes. Why haven't you responded for so long? Are you deaf?" Faced with the accusation, Su Weiqiu silently lowered his head. No wonder she didn't come to this Chengqiao for long. After adapting to the name Su Weiqiu, she went up the mountain on behalf of someone else. The words Uxin were completely unfamiliar to her. The supervisor looked at her up and down again and said, "You're lucky enough, kid. Come with me." Upon hearing this, Su Weiqiu turned around and glanced at Gooden. Gooden was also anxious and grabbed her with a worried expression, daring to ask, "Sir, where are you taking him?" The other person raised an eyebrow and asked in reverse, "Why, can I still explain to you when I lead someone away? Just a lowly person, living impatiently, isn't it?" With his fierce attack, Gooden was indeed intimidated. He quickly let go of his hand and stood obediently in place, afraid to make another mistake. The supervisor gave him a displeased glance and turned his head to Su Weiqiu, saying, "Let's go. Here, these laborers are tools for being appointed by others, and there is no room for half-freedom." After arriving here, Su Weiqiu knew what it meant to be a man for a knife and eye for fish and meat. She turned her head to look at Gooden and silently followed the supervisor away from the factory. At the foot of the mountain, the supervisor handed her over to another person who led her through the food and accommodation area of the workers, followed a horse path into a shady path, and walked about 2 miles. Suddenly, a house with a courtyard appeared in front of her. Su Weiqiu was stunned. Although this building may not be considered grand, amidst the mountains and forests, it seemed like an idyllic peach garden. She was quickly led in, and the two of them walked through the front yard, corridor, and along a bluestone road to a house with a courtyard, with the red wooden door tightly closed. The guide glanced at her tattered grass shoes covered in mud on her feet and said, "I have something else to do. You can just wait here." Su Weiqiu grabbed him tightly and asked, "Brother, could you please tell me why you brought me here? Don't ask so many questions, you will naturally know when the others come. Remember, just wait here, you can't go anywhere. The other party repeatedly reminded them before hastily leaving. Since everyone had told her so, Su Weiqiu had to stand still and wait, silently looking around under the eaves. The surrounding courtyard walls were quite high, and as far as I could see, everything was spotless. The large courtyard in front of me was also completely devoid of any weeds, indicating that the owner of this house is a very clean person. Although only separated by a hill, compared to the ancient Phoenix Mountain 2 miles away, this place is like heaven and earth. It is midsummer, and the poisonous sun is roasting the earth. The ancient Phoenix Mountain is like a steamer, and as soon as it starts working, the workers have no time to feel dry. When she just went down the mountain, she was also sweating profusely, but here it was shaded by green trees, not very cool. The colorful sunshine that shone through the treetops was like the starry sky in February. After only a moment, she had already felt a lot of freshness on her body. Su Weiqiu thought he only needed to wait for a moment, but when he waited left and right, no one came. There was no one around except her own outer space. At first, she stood obediently, but later on, when she got tired from standing, she decided to sit down on the stone steps in front of the door. In a state of boredom, she picked up a stone on the ground and gently drew it. Soon, a beautiful flower appeared on the sand. She looked at it and was not very satisfied, so she gently wiped it off with her foot. A yellow warbler jumped up and down on the branch, and she casually sketched a few strokes. Soon, a vivid picture of the yellow warbler appeared in front of her. The gentle breeze brushed against her face, and the cool breeze was even more comfortable than the air-conditioned room she used to use in the office of the 3rd hospital. Last night, due to the unbearable pain from a whiplash on her back, she almost stayed up all night. Sitting, she felt like she had returned to her childhood, lying alone on the old man's rocking chair in front of the small bungalow door, with the fan blowing continuously towards her face. Unable to resist drowsiness, she slowly bumped her eyelids and the stones in her hand rolled onto the ground. After a while, she heard a rustling sound. She slowly opened her eyes and saw a tall and thin figure sweeping the ground not far away. "Grandpa, don't make me sleep," she reminded and closed her eyes again. The other person heard her voice and turned around to say something to her, but she didn't hear it clearly. After yawning, she fell asleep again. Zhao Yan slept out, pushed open the door, and saw a person lying on the stone steps at the door. The person was sleeping soundly, and a ray of sunlight fell on the back of his head. Through the sleeping person, he suddenly seemed to see a child of 5 or 6 years old, with the same coarse cloth, tattered clothes, and messy buns. He approached with a light step, squatted down, and reached out to push. The other person murmured, but still didn't wake up. He patiently pushed again, and the sleeping person finally changed their movements under constant harassment, revealing a face covered in dirt. "Hey, don't sleep, wake up." Su Weiqiu opened her eyes and saw a face as beautiful as a mixed race, thinking she was dreaming. She quickly closed her eyes again. Soon, she was awakened again, and the person looked at her and asked, "Are you tired?" The voice was very gentle, like a spring breeze. Su Weiqiu nodded sincerely. "You come with me." The other party waved at her. Su Weiqiu looked at the other person in confusion, only to hear him say again, "Go inside and sleep, lying on the ground can easily catch a cold." This gentle voice seemed to have a magical power. Su Weiqiu slowly got up from the ground, glanced at the other person, and saw that his predecessor nodded at him. At this moment, her whole body is sore, her head is dull, and she is extremely tired. She was in urgent need of rest, and half asleep and half awake, she could only hear someone asking her to go into the room to sleep. So she raised her feet and stumbled into the room. Quickly, a noble concubine lounge chair appeared in front of me, looking more comfortable than my grandfather's elderly rocking chair. So she struggled with her drowsiness and approached it step by step. Chang'eng in the yard looked at the scene with fear on his face. End of this chapter.